I never imagined that taking a 2-week vacation to Hawaii would result in a stranger living in my mountain cabin. But when I pulled up to my property in the Colorado Rockies and saw smoke coming from the chimney, my stomach dropped like a stone. My name is Isaac Henderson, and I had owned this cabin outside of Aspen for nearly 8 years. It was my refuge, my escape from the chaos of running a consulting business in Denver. The cabin sat on 3 acres of pristine wilderness, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a valley that took your breath away every single morning. I had purchased it specifically because it was remote, private, and most importantly, nowhere near any homeowners association. Or so I thought. The trouble started about 6 months before this incident, when a group of property owners in the area decided to form what they called the Mountain Ridge Property Owners Association. I had ignored their initial letters because my deed explicitly stated that my property was not subject to any covenants, conditions, or restrictions. My lawyer had made absolutely certain of that when I bought the place. But these people were persistent, sending me letter after letter insisting that all property owners in the geographical area were automatically members and subject to their rules. I had sent them a certified letter explaining that my property was not part of their association and to stop contacting me. That was 3 months ago, and I had not heard anything since. I figured they had finally gotten the message. I was wrong. As I got out of my truck, my golden retriever Max jumping out behind me, I could see that someone had definitely been living in my cabin. There were potted plants on the porch that I had never seen before, a welcome mat with some inspirational quote on it, and worst of all, the front door had a new wreath hanging on it. My blood started to boil as I walked up the steps. I tried my key in the lock, but it would not turn. She had changed my locks, on my own property. I knocked hard on the door, my frustration mounting with each passing second. Max was barking, sensing my agitation. A woman in her late 40s opened the door, wearing a cardigan and glasses on a chain around her neck. She had that particular hairstyle that seemed to be a requirement for middle-aged women who spent their time making other people miserable, the kind of severe bob that screamed, "I would like to speak to the manager." "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Can you help me?" I repeated, incredulous. "This is my cabin. What are you doing in my house?" She pursed her lips and pulled out a folder that she apparently kept right by the door. "I am Susan Whitmore, president of the Mountain Ridge Property Owners Association. This property has been seized by the association due to multiple violations and unpaid fines totaling $17,000. I stared at her, genuinely unable to process what I was hearing. "Seized? You cannot seize my property. I am not even a member of your association. I have a deed that says this property is not subject to any HOA." Susan shook her head like a school teacher disappointed in a particularly dim student. "All properties within the Mountain Ridge geographical boundaries are automatically subject to our authority. Your property has been in violation of our aesthetic guidelines for months. The exterior paint color is not on the approved list. You have not maintained the landscaping to our standards, and you failed to submit architectural plans before installing that satellite dish. I bought this cabin 8 years ago. That satellite dish has been there since before your association even existed. You have absolutely no authority over my property, and you are currently committing criminal trespassing and breaking and entering." I pulled out my phone. "I am calling the sheriff right now." She had the audacity to laugh. "Go ahead. We have filed all the proper paperwork with the county. We followed every legal procedure. The sheriff will tell you the same thing I am telling you. You owe the association $17,000 in fines, plus another $3,000 for the cost of securing and maintaining the property. Once you pay, submit proof of correcting all violations and agree to follow all future guidelines. You can petition the board for return of the property. I was already dialing. We will see about that. The Pitkin County Sheriff's Office transferred me to a deputy who said he could be there in about 45 minutes. Susan remained standing in the doorway of my cabin, arms crossed, looking smug. I went back to my truck to wait, my mind racing through everything I knew about property law. I was not a lawyer, but I knew enough to understand that an HOA could not just seize property that was not actually part of the association. They would need a judgment from a court, and even then, the process involved liens and foreclosure, not just breaking in and changing the locks. While I waited, I called my attorney, Gerald Morrison, who handled all my real estate matters. It was a Saturday afternoon, but he answered on the third ring. "Isaac, how was Hawaii?" he asked cheerfully. "Gerald, I need you to tell me that I am not crazy. Can an HOA seize a property that is not actually part of the association?" There was a pause. "What happened?" I explained the entire situation, trying to keep my voice level. I could hear him typing on his computer as I talked. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "Even if you were part of the association, which you are not, they would need to go through a formal foreclosure process, which takes months and requires multiple court filings. What they have done is illegal on multiple levels. We are talking about burglary, trespassing, possibly fraud if they filed false documents with the county. Do not let her leave before the sheriff gets there." "She does not seem inclined to go anywhere," I said, watching Susan still standing in the doorway. She had pulled out her phone and was talking to someone, probably another board member. "I am getting in my car now. I will be there in about 2 hours. Record everything, take pictures, and make sure the sheriff understands that this woman broke into your home." The deputy arrived in a cruiser marked with the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office seal. He was a man in his early 30s with a serious expression. His nameplate read Deputy Martinez. "You called about a trespassing situation?" he asked as he got out of his vehicle. I quickly explained who I was and that I had returned from vacation to find Susan living in my cabin. "She claims that her HOA seized the property, but my property is not part of any HOA. She broke in, changed my locks, and has been living here." Deputy Martinez looked at Susan, who had walked down from the porch with her folder. "Madam, is this your property?" "It is property under the control of the Mountain Ridge Property Owners Association," she said, handing him papers from her folder. "We followed all proper procedures. Mr. Henderson has been notified multiple times of violations and unpaid fines. We exercised our legal right to secure the property." The deputy looked through her papers. I could see my attorney's car coming up the long driveway, dust kicking up behind his BMW. "These look like HOA violation notices and fines," Deputy Martinez said. "But I do not see any court order or foreclosure documents. Do you have documentation showing that a court gave you possession of this property?" Susan's confident expression faltered slightly. "The association's legal authority is documented in our bylaws and covenants." "That is not what I asked. Do you have a court order?" "We do not need a court order. The property owner was notified and failed to comply." My attorney arrived and immediately introduced himself to the deputy. "Deputy Martinez, I am Gerald Morrison, Mr. Henderson's attorney. What this woman has done is criminal trespassing and burglary at minimum. Mr. Henderson's property is explicitly not subject to any HOA restrictions per his recorded deed. Even if it were, no HOA can seize property without going through a judicial foreclosure process, which can take 6 months to over a year and requires multiple court hearings. Susan's face was reddening. We have every right to enforce our community standards. No, you do not, Gerald said flatly. Not on his property, and certainly not by breaking in and changing the locks while he was on vacation. Deputy, I would like to file a formal criminal complaint against Miss Whitmore for burglary, criminal trespassing, and criminal mischief. Deputy Martinez looked uncomfortable but nodded. Sir, do you have proof that this is your property? I pulled out my wallet and showed him my driver's license with this address on it, then opened my truck to get the folder I kept with my property documents, including my deed and insurance papers. Gerald had copies of everything on his laptop and showed the deputy the recorded deed with its explicit language excluding the property from any future HOA or covenant restrictions. Madam, you need to vacate this property immediately, Deputy Martinez said to Susan. You have no legal right to be here. This is outrageous. I have been maintaining this property for the past 2 weeks. I have personal belongings inside. You can collect your personal belongings under supervision and then you need to leave. Mr. Henderson, do you want her arrested? I looked at Susan, who suddenly looked less confident and more worried. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, but the practical part of my brain took over. I want to see what she has done to my cabin first. But yes, I intend to press full charges. Deputy Martinez nodded. Madam, I am going to escort you inside to collect your belongings. Mr. Henderson and his attorney can accompany us to document the condition of the property. We all went inside, and I felt my anger surge again as I looked around. Susan had completely rearranged my furniture. She had taken down my artwork and replaced it with her own decorations. My books were in boxes in the corner, and she had put up lace curtains in the windows. The kitchen had been reorganized entirely, and I could see she had thrown away some of my food and replaced it with her own groceries. She broke in and redecorated, I said, my voice tight with anger. She literally moved in like she owned the place. Gerald was taking photos with his phone, documenting everything. This strengthens the burglary charge significantly. She did not just enter illegally. She moved in with the intent to deprive you of your property. Susan was grabbing her clothes from the bedroom, stuffing them into a suitcase. This is harassment. The association will be hearing about this treatment. The police will be hearing about this treatment, I shot back. You broke into my home. It took about 30 minutes for Susan to gather all her belongings. Deputy Martinez checked each bag and box to make sure she was not taking any of my possessions. When she was finally ready to leave, the deputy turned to her. Miss Whitmore, I am issuing you a citation for criminal trespassing. You will need to appear in court. Mr. Henderson, you will need to come to the station to file a formal complaint for the burglary and other charges. I am also going to call in my supervisor, because this situation is unusual enough that I want a second opinion on the charges. A sergeant arrived about 20 minutes later, and after reviewing everything, agreed that Susan's actions constituted burglary, criminal trespassing, and criminal mischief at minimum. She was arrested on the spot, handcuffed, and put in the back of Deputy Martinez's cruiser. The look on her face as they drove away was a mixture of shock and indignation. Gerald and I spent the next 2 hours documenting everything in the cabin, taking photographs and making notes. He called a locksmith who could come out the next day to change all the locks again. I was emotionally exhausted, but also furious about the violation of my property and privacy. What happens now? I asked Gerald as we sat on the porch, Max curled up at my feet. Now we make sure she faces serious consequences, he said. We file a civil lawsuit against her personally and against the HOA for damages. We push for maximum criminal charges. And we make it very clear to this association that they have no authority over your property and that any further harassment will result in additional legal action, including potential restraining orders. I spent that night in my cabin, though it felt violated and wrong. I could not stop thinking about Susan living here, sleeping in my bed, using my things, acting like she had every right to be here. The next morning, I drove to the sheriff's office to file formal charges and give a complete statement. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Sarah Brennan. She was thorough and professional, taking detailed notes as I explained everything from the HOA's initial contact, attempts to finding Susan in my cabin. "This is one of the more brazen cases I have seen," she admitted. "Most HOA disputes involve liens and legal battles, not breaking and entering. We are treating this as a serious burglary case. I also want to investigate whether other members of the HOA board were involved in planning this. If they were, they could face conspiracy charges." She mentioned filing paperwork with the county, I said. "Could that be fraud?" "Potentially, yes. If they filed false documents claiming legal authority they did not have, that could be filing a false instrument, which is a separate crime. I am going to subpoena their records and communications." Over the next few days, the story got more interesting and more disturbing. Detective Brennan discovered that Susan had not acted entirely alone. The HOA board had held a meeting where they discussed taking control of non-compliant properties and had voted to authorize Susan, as president, to secure my cabin. 3 other board members had been present when they changed my locks, and one of them had even helped Susan move her belongings into my cabin. All 4 were eventually arrested. The other 3 board members were named Patricia Lowenstein, Karen Sullivan, and Robert Vaughn. Karen Sullivan, the vice president, had apparently suggested the plan initially, arguing that they needed to make an example of property owners who refused to acknowledge the association's authority. The irony of the HOA vice president actually being named Karen was not lost on anyone. My civil attorney, a tough woman named Rebecca Chen who specialized in property disputes, filed a lawsuit seeking $200,000 in damages from the individuals and the HOA itself. She also filed for an injunction permanently barring the association from any contact with me or any claim over my property. "The criminal case will help us significantly," Rebecca explained during one of our meetings. "But even without it, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of HOA overreach I have ever seen. They had absolutely no legal basis for any of their actions. The criminal case moved forward faster than I expected." The district attorney, seeing the evidence, and the fact that this involved multiple defendants who had essentially conspired to steal someone's house, decided to prosecute aggressively. Susan and the other board members were each charged with first-degree burglary, criminal trespassing, conspiracy, and theft. The fraud charges were still being investigated. The preliminary hearing was held on a cold morning in February, about 6 weeks after I had found Susan in my cabin. I sat in the courtroom with Gerald, watching as Susan and her co-defendants stood before the judge. They had all hired lawyers, of course, expensive ones who tried to argue that this was merely a civil dispute and that their clients had acted in good faith based on the association's bylaws. The prosecutor, a sharp assistant district attorney named Michael Ross, was having none of it. "Your Honor, these defendants broke into an occupied residence while the owner was on vacation. They changed the locks. They moved in. One of them, Miss Whitmore, was literally living in Mr. Henderson's home, sleeping in his bed, using his possessions. This was not a good faith mistake. This was a calculated plan to steal a man's property because he refused to bow to their made-up authority. The fact that they dressed it up in HOA language does not make it any less criminal. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Judge William Patterson, agreed. He found probable cause for all charges and scheduled the case for trial. He also increased bail for all defendants after the prosecutor argued they had shown a willingness to violate property rights and might flee. As we left the courthouse, a reporter from the local news approached me. The story had gotten some media attention, particularly because it highlighted the darker side of HOA overreach. "Mr. Henderson, how do you feel about the charges being upheld?" "I feel like justice is being served," I said. No one should ever come home from vacation to find a stranger living in their house. The fact that these people thought they had the right to do this, because of some HOA they created, is absolutely insane. I hope this sends a message that you cannot just take over someone's property because you disagree with them or because you want to impose your rules on them. The trial was scheduled for May, but in early April, Rebecca called me with news. "They want to settle," she said. "All of them." The HOA's insurance company has gotten involved, and they are pushing hard for a settlement because they know they will lose at trial. What are they offering? $1.5 million, complete dissolution of the HOA, written admissions of wrongdoing. And they are not opposing any criminal plea deals. I was silent for a moment. The money was significant, more than I had expected, but what really mattered was the admission of wrongdoing and the dissolution of the HOA. No one else would have to deal with their harassment. What about the criminal charges? The DA is offering plea deals. Susan and Karen would plead guilty to felony burglary and get 3 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 18 months. The other two would plead to lesser charges with shorter sentences and probation. All of them would have to pay restitution and would be permanently barred from serving on any HOA board. I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to see them all go through a full trial and get maximum sentences, but the practical part of me knew that trials were unpredictable and emotionally draining. This settlement gave me everything I really wanted: compensation, accountability, and an end to the HOA. "I will accept it," I said, "but I want it all in writing, and I want the dissolution of the HOA to be immediate and permanent." The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. I received a check for $1.5 million, paid by the HOA's insurance company and the personal assets of the board members. The Mountain Ridge Property Owners Association filed paperwork to permanently dissolve and sent letters to everyone they had been harassing, informing them that the association no longer existed and that all fines and demands were void. Susan and Karen pleaded guilty in a court hearing that I attended. I watched as they stood before Judge Patterson, admitting that they had burglarized my home and violated my property rights. The judge was not gentle with them. "You are educated, middle-class citizens who decided that your desire for control and your petty rules were more important than the law," he said, looking directly at Susan. "You violated Mr. Henderson's home in one of the most fundamental ways possible. You took advantage of his absence to steal his property. The only reason you are receiving this plea deal is because Mr. Henderson has agreed to it. I want to be clear. I believe you both deserve longer sentences. You will serve 3 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. I hope you use that time to reflect on the damage you caused and the rights you violated." Susan was crying as they led her away in handcuffs. Karen looked pale and shocked, as if she had only just realized the consequences of her actions. The other two board members pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges the following week and received jail time plus probation. In the aftermath, I spent several months restoring my cabin to how I wanted it. I replaced all the locks myself this time, installed a sophisticated security system with cameras, and made sure everything was exactly as I liked it. The violation of my space had been profound, and it took time to feel comfortable there again. Max helped. Dogs have a way of making anywhere feel like home. The civil settlement money was substantial, but I did not feel like I had won some lottery. It was compensation for having my life turned upside down, for the stress and violation and anger of having someone break into my sanctuary. I used some of it to make improvements to the cabin, and donated a significant portion to organizations that help people fight HOA overreach and abuse. Rebecca told me that my case had attracted attention from property rights groups across the country. Apparently, HOA abuse was more common than I had realized, with countless stories of associations imposing ridiculous fines for minor violations, foreclosing on homes over tiny unpaid amounts, and generally making people's lives miserable. My case was unusual because of how brazen it was, but the underlying problem was widespread. I was interviewed by several news outlets and even appeared on a podcast about property rights. I tried to make clear that while not all HOAs were bad, the lack of oversight and accountability made them ripe for abuse by people who enjoyed having power over their neighbors. The problem is that people like Susan and Karen were drawn to the HOA board specifically because they wanted power, I explained during one interview. They were not trying to maintain property values or create a nice community. They wanted to tell other people what to do, and when someone refused to submit to their authority, they escalated until they were literally committing crimes. There needs to be better regulation of HOAs, better protections for homeowners, and serious consequences when HOA boards cross the line. By the summer, life had largely returned to normal. I spent weekends at my cabin, hiked with Max, and enjoyed the peace and privacy that I had bought the property for in the first place. The security cameras gave me peace of mind, though they were probably unnecessary. Susan and Karen were in prison. The HOA was dissolved, and everyone in the area knew what had happened. I did receive a few letters from other property owners in the area, thanking me for standing up to the association. Several of them had been harassed with ridiculous fines and demands. One elderly couple had been threatened with foreclosure over the color of their mailbox. Another family had been fined thousands of dollars because their teenage son's car was supposedly unsightly. With the HOA dissolved, all of that went away. One afternoon in July, I was sitting on my porch when a car pulled up. A woman in her 30s got out looking nervous. "Mr. Henderson, I am Jennifer Ross. I hope it is okay that I stopped by." "Can I help you?" I asked, standing up. Max trotted over to sniff her, tail wagging. "I just wanted to thank you in person. I live about 2 miles from here, and the HOA had been making our lives hell for the past year. They fined us $8,000 for building a shed without their approval, even though we built it before they even formed the association. We were trying to fight it, but we could not afford a lawyer, and they were threatening to foreclose. When the association dissolved as part of your settlement, all of that went away. You literally saved our home." I felt a wave of emotion. I am glad I could help, even if it was not my intention. What they were doing to people was wrong. We talked for a while, and she told me stories about other families in the area who had been targeted by the association. The common thread was always the same. The HOA had formed recently. The board members were power-hungry people who enjoyed making rules and punishing violations, and they went after anyone who challenged their authority. My case had been the most extreme, but I was far from the only victim. After she left, I thought about how different things could have been. If I had not had a good lawyer, if I had not had the resources to fight back, if the sheriff's office had not taken it seriously, Susan might still be living in my cabin while I fought a long legal battle to reclaim my own property. The system had worked in my case, but I knew it did not always work that way. The criminal case officially closed in September when Susan and Karen were transferred to different correctional facilities to begin serving their sentences. Detective Brennan called to let me know and to thank me for my cooperation throughout the investigation. This case was unusual, but it was also pretty straightforward once we got into their records, she said. They documented everything in their board meeting minutes. They literally wrote down their plan to break into your house and claim it for the HOA. I have never seen defendants make it so easy to prosecute them. Arrogance, I said. They genuinely believed they had the right to do what they did. That is the sense I got too. Anyway, the case is closed on our end. The DA's office might call you if anything comes up with appeals, but I doubt it. They all pleaded guilty, so there is not much to appeal. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a sense of closure. It had been almost a year since that shocking day when I came home to find Susan in my cabin. The legal battles were over, the criminals were in prison, and the HOA was permanently dissolved. Life could finally return to normal. I spent the rest of that year enjoying my cabin, taking the time to reconnect with the peace and solitude that had drawn me to the property in the first place. Max and I went on long hikes through the mountains, and I started inviting friends up for weekend visits. Slowly, the cabin stopped feeling like a crime scene and started feeling like home again. One of my friends, a guy named Tom who I had known since college, came up for a weekend in October. We were sitting by the fire pit outside, drinking beer and watching the stars when he brought up the whole situation. "I still cannot believe someone just moved into your house," he said, shaking his head. "Like, the audacity of it is mind-blowing." "It was surreal," I admitted. Even now, looking back, it feels like something that could not have actually happened. But it did. What made them think they could get away with it? I thought about that question, which I had asked myself many times. I think they had convinced themselves that they were in the right. They had created this HOA, written up all these official-looking documents, and they genuinely believed that gave them authority over everyone in the area. When I refused to acknowledge that authority, it threatened their entire worldview. So they escalated, probably telling themselves the whole time that they were just enforcing the rules. That is crazy. It is, but it is also surprisingly common, not the breaking in part that was unusual. But HOA boards abusing their power, making up rules, imposing massive fines, and making people's lives miserable, that happens all the time. I got lucky that I had the resources to fight back, and that I had explicitly protected my property from HOA control when I bought it. A lot of people are not that fortunate. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest. Finally, Tom spoke again. "So what would you say to someone who is thinking about buying property in an HOA? Read everything before you sign. Understand exactly what authority you are giving the HOA over your property. Look into the board members and how they operate. Talk to other homeowners in the community. And make sure you can actually afford the dues and that you are willing to follow their rules, because if you cannot or will not, they can make your life a living hell. Or, better yet, find property that is not in an HOA at all. You make it sound pretty grim. Some HOAs are fine. They maintain common areas, enforce reasonable rules, and stay out of people's way. But when you get people like Susan and Karen on the board, people who are there because they like having power over others, it can go bad fast. And homeowners often have limited recourse because the law gives HOAs a lot of authority. The conversation drifted to other topics, but the question stayed with me. In the months following the resolution of my case, I had received dozens of emails and messages from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Most of them were not as extreme as mine, but they were still stories of harassment, unreasonable fines, and people who felt trapped in their own homes by the very association that was supposed to serve them. I started thinking about ways to help. I was not a lawyer or an activist, but I had a platform now and resources from the settlement. I reached out to some of the property rights organizations I had been in contact with and asked how I could contribute. The result was a fund to help homeowners fight unjust HOA actions. It was not much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. By the time the anniversary of that terrible day rolled around, I had found a sense of peace with what had happened. The violation still angered me when I thought about it, but it no longer dominated my thoughts. Susan and Karen were in prison, serving time for their crimes. The HOA was gone. My cabin was secure and truly mine in every sense. I marked the anniversary by inviting my parents up for the weekend. They had been horrified by the whole situation when it happened, and had wanted me to sell the cabin and buy something else. But I had refused. This was my place, my refuge, and I was not going to let Susan and her criminal friends drive me away from it. My father, a retired engineer named Harold, walked around the property with me, admiring the security improvements I had made. "You have really made this place a fortress," he observed, looking at the cameras and new fencing. "I just want to make sure it never happens again," I said. "Not that I think it will, but peace of mind is worth the investment. Your mother was worried about you for months," he said quietly. "She kept having nightmares about someone breaking into our house. I am sorry. I did not mean for any of this to affect you too. Do not be sorry. You did not do anything wrong. Those people did, and they are paying for it now." He put his hand on my shoulder. "You handled it exactly right. You did not let them intimidate you. You stood up for your rights, and you made sure they faced real consequences. I am proud of you." That meant more to me than I expected, and I had to blink back unexpected tears. The whole experience had been traumatic in ways I had not fully processed, and hearing my father's support helped. My mother, Anne, spent the weekend cooking and fussing over me, which was her way of showing love. She made my favorite meals and insisted on cleaning everything, even though I tried to tell her the cabin was already clean. "I just cannot stand the thought of that woman being in your space," she said, scrubbing the kitchen counters for the third time. "Touching your things, sleeping in your bed. It makes me so angry. She is in prison now, Mom. She cannot hurt anyone else. Good. She deserves every day of that sentence." We spent the evenings playing board games and talking, carefully avoiding the subject of the HOA until my father brought it up on Sunday morning. "Have you heard anything from the other board members?" he asked. "No. Their lawyers sent formal apologies as part of the settlement, but I have not had any direct contact. Robert and Patricia are on probation, I think. I do not really keep track. And the property values in the area. Has this affected them? Actually, I think they have gone up. Once the HOA dissolved and people did not have to worry about ridiculous fines and restrictions, the area became more attractive. Several properties have sold in the last few months." My father nodded, satisfied. "Good. That is how it should be. People should be able to enjoy their property without someone breathing down their necks over the color of their mailbox." After my parents left, I spent the rest of the day doing maintenance around the cabin. It was therapeutic, the simple work of staining the deck and clearing brush. Max supervised, lounging in the sun and occasionally barking at squirrels. As I worked, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. I had gone from being a relatively carefree cabin owner to someone who had been through a bizarre criminal ordeal, fought a legal battle, and become an accidental advocate for property rights. It was not a path I would have chosen, but I had learned a lot about myself and about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult and expensive. The settlement money had made a real difference. Beyond the fund I had set up to help other homeowners, I had also been able to make improvements to my consulting business and had donated to several local charities. The money could not undo the violation, but at least it was being put to good use. As winter approached, I found myself spending more time at the cabin. The quiet of the mountains in the snow was peaceful in a way that the city never was. I worked remotely when I needed to, but mostly I just enjoyed being there, reading by the fire, hiking with Max, and appreciating the simple fact that my home was truly mine. In December, I received a letter from Susan. It had been forwarded through my attorney, as I had made it clear I did not want any direct contact. Gerald called me to ask if I wanted him to read it first or just return it unopened. "What does she say?" I asked, curious despite myself. "It is an apology letter. She talks about how she realizes what she did was wrong, how she let her desire for control and order override her judgment, and how she is sorry for violating your home and your trust. She is not asking for anything or making excuses. It is just an apology. Does it seem sincere? Hard to say. It could be genuine, or it could be part of some attempt to show rehabilitation for a parole hearing down the road. But for what it is worth, it does not read like a manipulative letter. It reads like someone who has had time to think about what they did and feels genuinely terrible. Keep it on file, but I do not want to respond. I am glad she is reflecting on her actions, but I do not owe her forgiveness or closure. Understood? I will file it with the case documents." I thought about that letter for days afterward. Part of me was glad that Susan seemed to be taking responsibility for what she had done. But another part of me was still angry, still hurt by the profound violation of having a stranger break into my home and live there as if it was hers. Forgiveness was not something I was ready for, and maybe I never would be. That was okay. I had a right to my feelings. Christmas that year was quiet. I spent it at the cabin with Max, enjoying the snow and the peace. A few friends came up for a small celebration, and it was exactly what I needed. No drama, no stress, just good people and good conversation in a place that finally felt safe again. As the new year began, I found myself thinking about the future. The whole experience with Susan and the HOA had been terrible, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about standing up for myself, about the importance of documentation and legal protections, and about the ways that seemingly mundane disputes could escalate into serious criminal matters. I decided to be more involved in local property rights issues, attending county meetings and speaking out when I saw potential problems. I also made a point of helping other property owners understand their rights and how to protect themselves from HOA overreach. It was not glamorous work, but it felt important. One afternoon in February, almost exactly a year after Susan's court hearing, I was at the county offices looking into some permit requirements when I ran into Detective Brennan. "Mr. Henderson," she said, smiling. "How have you been?" "Good, thank you. Just trying to make sure all my paperwork is in order so I do not have any more surprise visitors." She laughed. "I do not think you have to worry about that. Your case made quite an impression. I have not heard of any other HOA problems in the county since then. That is good to hear. I have been meaning to ask you, have you considered writing about your experience? I think a lot of people could learn from what you went through. I have thought about it, I admitted. Maybe someday. For now, I am just enjoying being able to use my cabin without worrying about someone breaking in. We chatted for a few more minutes before going our separate ways, but her suggestion stayed with me. Maybe there was value in writing down the full story, not for publication necessarily, but just to process everything that had happened and maybe help others who found themselves in similar situations. I spent several evenings that month writing out the entire timeline of events, from the first unwanted HOA letter to the final resolution of the criminal cases. It was cathartic in a way I had not expected, forcing me to confront the fear and anger I had felt and to acknowledge how much the experience had changed me. By March, I had compiled a detailed account of everything, including copies of all the relevant legal documents, photos, and correspondence. I shared it with some property rights organizations, thinking it might be useful as a case study in HOA overreach. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People wanted to know more, wanted to understand how I had successfully fought back, wanted advice on their own situations. I found myself doing more interviews, speaking at community meetings, and corresponding with homeowners across the country who were dealing with difficult HOAs. It was not something I had planned to do, but it felt right. If my terrible experience could help others avoid similar situations, or give them the courage to stand up for their rights, then at least something good had come from it. As spring arrived and the snow melted from the mountains, I stood on my porch one morning and watched the sun rise over the valley. Max was beside me, his tail wagging contentedly. The cabin was exactly as I wanted it, secure and peaceful and truly mine. Susan was in prison. Karen was in prison. The HOA was dissolved. Justice had been served. It had been a long, difficult journey from that terrible day when I came home to find a stranger living in my house. But I had come through it stronger, more aware of my rights, and more committed to helping others protect theirs. The cabin remained my refuge, my escape from the chaos of daily life, and now it was safer than ever. I thought about all the people who had helped me along the way. Gerald and Rebecca, my attorneys who had fought tirelessly on my behalf, Detective Brennan and Deputy Martinez, who had taken my complaint seriously and investigated thoroughly, Judge Patterson, who had seen through Susan's attempts to justify her criminal behavior, and my family and friends, who had supported me through the stress and uncertainty. I also thought about all the people who did not have those resources, who could not afford good attorneys or did not have supportive law enforcement or were intimidated into giving up their rights. The system had worked for me, but I knew it did not always work that way. That was why the work I was doing now felt important, even if it was small scale. As the months passed and I settled into a new normal, I made peace with what had happened. The anger faded, replaced by a quiet determination to make sure that Susan and Karen's crimes had not been in vain. If my experience could educate others, protect them from similar situations, or give them the tools to fight back against abusive HOAs, then something good would come from something terrible. The cabin remained my sanctuary, and Max remained my constant companion. Life went on, richer and more purposeful than before. I had faced down criminals who tried to steal my home, and I had won, not just in court, but in reclaiming my peace of mind and my sense of security. And that, ultimately, was what mattered most. On a particularly beautiful day in May, I decided to have a small gathering at the cabin to celebrate the second anniversary of the resolution of the case. I invited everyone who had helped me: Gerald, Rebecca, Detective Brennan, even Deputy Martinez. Some could not make it due to work schedules, but Gerald and Rebecca both came, along with several of my friends and neighbors. We grilled steaks on the deck, drank good wine, and told stories. It was a celebration not just of legal victory, but of community and justice and the importance of standing up for what was right. As I looked around at the people gathered on my porch, I felt genuinely grateful. Yes, I had gone through something terrible. But I had also learned who my friends were, what I was capable of, and how important it was to fight for justice even when it was difficult. Gerald raised his glass in a toast. To Isaac, who refused to let criminals steal his home, and who has turned a terrible experience into a force for good. May your cabin always be a place of peace, and may you never have to deal with another HOA as long as you live. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. I smiled, looking out at the mountains that had drawn me to this place so many years ago. They were unchanging, eternal, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. Thank you, everyone, I said, for your help, your support, and your friendship. This place means everything to me, and thanks to all of you, it is truly mine again. To justice, to property rights, and to never giving up. We drank, we ate, and we enjoyed the perfect spring evening. Max ran around greeting everyone, his tail never stopping. The cabin was filled with laughter and light, exactly as it should be. The darkness of what Susan and Karen had done was in the past, and while it would never be forgotten, it no longer defined this place or my relationship to it. As the sun set and my guests began to leave, I stood alone on the porch for a moment, Max at my side. I thought about everything that had happened, all the twists and turns of this strange journey. I thought about Susan and Karen in prison, hopefully learning from their mistakes. I thought about the HOA that no longer existed and all the people who were now free from its tyranny. But mostly, I thought about the future. About all the peaceful weekends I would spend here, all the sunrises I would watch, all the hikes I would take with Max. This cabin was my sanctuary, my refuge, my home. And no one, not Susan, not Karen, not any HOA anywhere, would ever take that away from me again. I had protected what was mine. I had stood up for my rights. I had ensured that criminals faced justice, and I had helped others do the same. That was enough. That was everything. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge in the clear mountain sky, I went inside, Max following close behind. The cabin was warm and welcoming, filled with the memories of good times rather than the violation of the past. I had reclaimed it, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually. Tomorrow I would return to Denver, to my business and my regular life. But I would be back here next weekend, and the weekend after that, for as long as I owned this beautiful piece of mountain paradise. Because it was mine, truly and completely mine, and that simple fact brought me more joy than I could express. The story of HOA Karen, who moved into my vacation cabin, who was removed by the sheriff, and who I pressed criminal charges against, had a satisfying ending. Justice was served. The criminals were punished, the innocent were protected, and life, as it should, went on.